Winter 1941. The air over Britain hung heavy with smoke and fear. Each dawn revealed fewer planes on the tarmac, fewer men returning from the blackened skies over Europe. The hangars of Bomber Command echoed with the sounds of failure, engines coughing their last breath, wrenches clattering to the floor, and the hollow footsteps of men who had run out of miracles. Somewhere in that grey world of rain and rationed light, a single bulb burned through the night. Under it sat a man, sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow with exhaustion, the smell of cold oil and stale coffee clinging to him like guilt. His name was never written into history books, but every flight that came after carried a piece of his mind. He wasn't a pilot, nor a soldier in the way medals demanded. He was an engineer, one of those quiet men the war forgot to celebrate. His battlefield was a cluttered table covered in blueprints, radar charts, and the faint tremor of hope. For weeks, he'd been trying to answer one question: how do you hide a plane from something you cannot see? Every night, he'd return to the same conclusion: you couldn't. German radar. The invisible net stretched across the channel, caught their bombers before they even saw the coast. No matter how fast they flew, how low they dived, the enemy always knew. Dozens lost in a single night, each dot on the radar a life erased before it began. He had read every report, every technical memo, every desperate proposal from scientists across the country. None of it worked, and yet something in him refused to let go. He had seen strange things on those radar screens. Moments when a plane would blur, disappear for a second, then reappear miles away. No one could explain it. Most dismissed it as interference, noise, bad equipment. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in that noise lay an answer. The war outside didn't care for theories. It wanted results. Every time a bomber failed to return, a silent weight settled on his shoulders. He wasn't on those missions, but he felt every loss as if he were. The hum of the generators, the cold draft through the metal walls. All of it pressed in on him, whispering one cruel truth: time was running out. A gust of wind slipped through a cracked window, rustling the papers on his desk. He stared at the chaos of charts, thin red lines tracing flight paths that never came back. He rubbed his eyes. The numbers blurred together, just like the faces of the pilots who had once laughed in the mess hall and were now names on a list. In those hours before dawn, the base felt like another world. Somewhere outside, the distant thunder of engines signaled another squadron taking off, men heading into a night most wouldn't survive. He watched the faint glow on the horizon fade into darkness, and for a moment, he wondered if any of them would make it home. He reached for his mug, half full of lukewarm coffee, and set it beside the latest radar plot. The line curved, then vanished. Nothing unusual, but his mind kept drifting back to that question, the one that refused to die. Maybe the problem wasn't the radar itself. Maybe it was the way the signal reacted, the way it bounced, scattered, distorted. He needed to see it differently. But his body was giving up before his mind did. His fingers trembled from fatigue, his breath fogged the glass of the lamp. The smell of burning dust filled the room. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and tried to remember the last time he'd seen daylight. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the hangar. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, echoing like a gunshot. He didn't move. The war had reduced everything to patterns of sound and silence: engines, explosions, rain. Then it happened. As he reached for another sheet, his elbow caught the mug. A thin stream of coffee spilled across the paper, bleeding into the ink, spreading like a shadow. He cursed under his breath, grabbing a rag to stop the damage. But it was too late. The liquid had soaked the chart, staining the delicate lines of the radar printout. He froze. Something about the way the light caught the wet paper made him pause. The reflection shimmered oddly, bending the lamp's glow into soft waves. For a brief second, the lines beneath the stain seemed to distort, almost disappeared. He tilted the sheet, watching the reflection move. The distortion followed. The radar lines vanished, then reappeared as he shifted the angle. His exhaustion fought with curiosity. He leaned closer, holding the sheet beneath the light, tracing the warped ring of coffee. It wasn't just the stain. It was the way the surface changed the light itself, bending it, scattering it. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. It was small, uncertain. But it was there. He didn't yet understand what he was seeing. Not fully. But something inside him whispered that this accident, this mistake, meant more than it seemed. The clock struck 3. The base was silent, save for the hum of the generator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. He laid the paper flat again, staring at the mark like a man staring into the future without knowing it. He thought of the radar, of waves bouncing off metal, of reflections and echoes. What if you could make the signal behave differently? What if, instead of reflecting, it bent, just like that light beneath the coffee stain? He blinked, realizing how absurd it sounded. But the thought refused to leave. It burned through the fog of exhaustion, clearing the haze of failure. The stain still glistened faintly under the lamp, and in that warped circle of brown he saw not a mess, but a mystery. He picked up his pencil, scribbling a note beside the chart, just a few words: refraction, surface interference. Then he sat back, listening to the wind. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed faintly. Another alert, another raid. The war raged on, indifferent to the quiet spark that had just ignited in one forgotten corner of a British airfield. And though he didn't know it, that small ring of coffee on a ruined radar chart would one day change everything. Morning came slow and colorless. The sun barely pierced the fog that rolled across the airfield, settling like a ghost over the hangars. Men moved like shadows, their breath visible in the cold. Somewhere a radio crackled, bringing news of another night of losses. He didn't need to hear the numbers, he already knew what they meant. He hadn't slept. The coffee stain still marked the radar sheet in front of him, now dry, the paper stiff and warped. What had caught his attention last night still lingered in his mind. That strange shimmer, that moment of disappearance. Most would have thrown it away. He couldn't. Not when so many were dying for lack of an answer. He studied the sheet again, holding it up to the light. The dried stain had formed a thin film that caught the light at just the right angle, bending it around the paper fibers. It reminded him of how heat distorted air above a runway, visible yet untouchable. What if radio waves could be tricked the same way? What if instead of bouncing off the surface of the plane, they could be bent around it? The idea was ridiculous, impossible even. But so was radar once. He leaned forward, tracing the stain with his pencil, sketching rough lines across the margin. Equations spilled from his memory, wave patterns, interference models, refraction. He wrote until the page filled with scrawls, his handwriting growing tighter, faster, more desperate. His colleague, a young technician named Lewis, entered quietly with 2 mugs of tea. "You've been here all night again, haven't you?" he said softly. The engineer didn't answer. He just pointed to the paper. Lewis frowned. "Coffee stains. Look closer," the engineer whispered. "The reflection, see how it bends. If a material could do that to radar, it might not be seen at all." Lewis stared, unsure whether to laugh or worry. "You think we can make planes disappear?" "Not disappear," he said, his eyes distant. "Just harder to find." The younger man shrugged, unsure how to respond. "Command won't fund theories. They barely have fuel for the next sortie." "I know." The engineer's tone was calm, almost resigned. "But maybe this isn't a theory anymore." He returned to the drafting table. His hands moved with renewed purpose, sketching layers of fabric and foil, imagining how materials could scatter a signal. It was crude, almost foolish, but it was a start. The hours passed unnoticed. Outside, bombers rumbled to life again, engines roaring against the wind. He barely heard them. Every sound now seemed to echo his thoughts: vibration, frequency, resonance. The air itself felt alive with possibilities. He knew radar waves behaved like light. If light could be bent, so could they. The answer wasn't in metal or armor, but in manipulation, turning the signal into something unrecognizable. A ghost on the screen. He scribbled the phrase almost unconsciously: ghost plane. The words looked strange, almost forbidden. He underlined them once, then twice. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the base lights flickered on one by one. The engineer sat still, the stain now dry and brittle, a small circle of inspiration surrounded by chaos. The others left for the mess hall, laughter faint in the distance. He stayed behind, alone with his impossible thought. The world outside was breaking itself apart, and yet, in this small forgotten room, something extraordinary had quietly begun. He gathered his papers, folded the radar sheet carefully, and placed it at the top of the stack. For the first time in months, his exhaustion carried a strange comfort. There was a direction now, uncertain, fragile, but real. He turned off the lamp. The room fell into half darkness, the last light glinting off the rim of his mug. The stain on the chart caught that light once more, glimmering faintly like a secret trying to be heard. He paused at the doorway, looking back one last time. The faint hum of machines filled the silence. In that sound, he imagined something else. The whisper of a future where planes no longer glowed on enemy screens, where men could cross the night unseen. He didn't know it yet, but the idea born in that quiet room, beneath a single hanging bulb and a stain of coffee, would one day shift the balance of an entire war. By the spring of 1942, the skies above Britain no longer belonged to dreamers. They belonged to ghosts, the ones who never came home. Every mission report sounded the same: lost contact at Yo Tozen 17. No response beyond the channel. Presumed down. Inside the operations rooms, silence had replaced optimism. Maps once marked with bright pins of progress now looked like gravesites of red ink. The engineers who had promised miracles were running out of explanations. And in the middle of that chaos, one man kept returning to his desk, chasing a theory no one else believed. The engineer had sent his first memo weeks ago. A thin report proposing radar interference through surface refraction. It reached command in London, where it was stamped, catalogued, and quietly forgotten. Speculative, they called it. No practical basis. In a war drowning in speculation, one more idea meant nothing. He didn't stop. Night after night, he refined the concept. He borrowed scrap aluminum from the maintenance crews, layered it with waxed fabric, and tested the pieces under crude transmitters. The results were faint, unpredictable, inconsistent. But every once in a while a radar echo would fade just slightly. A whisper of success buried in noise. To him, that whisper meant everything. To others, it was just static. Rumors started spreading through the hangars. That fellow in the corners trying to make planes invisible, they joked. Laughter was easier than belief. The pilots respected him but pitied his obsession. They saw the toll it took, the sleepless nights, the ink-stained hands, the slow unraveling of a man who couldn't stop thinking. One evening, his supervisor called him in. The office smelled of tobacco and damp wool. "You're chasing ghosts." "Man," the officer said quietly, "we need results, not riddles." The engineer didn't argue. He simply looked at the floor. "Sir, I think we're closer than you realize." "Closer to what?" "Magic." The officer scoffed. "There's a war on. Men are dying. You've had your time. We're moving on to other proposals." The meeting ended with a dismissal that felt like exile. He left without a word, walking back through the rain, slicked airfield. The engines were warming for another night's sortie. He stopped and watched them for a moment, silhouettes against floodlights. Men climbing aboard with that quiet acceptance only soldiers know. He clenched his fists, the rain cold on his skin. If his idea died here, so would they. Back in his workshop, he lit the lamp and unfolded the same coffee-stained radar chart. It was wrinkled and brittle now, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It reminded him of why he'd started, not for recognition, but for survival. The stain glowed faintly under the light, a circle of imperfection that still seemed to hold the shape of possibility. He picked up a sheet of tin foil and stretched it across the edge of a wooden frame. The material crinkled softly. He moved a small radar emitter across it, watching the reflection pulse on the monitor. A clean, sharp echo. Then he pressed a thin layer of wax paper across the foil. The echo blurred, not gone but softer, distorted. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't vanishing, but it was changing. That was enough to keep him awake for another night. He wrote it all down, the configurations, the materials, the minute differences in reflection strength. The logbook filled with small victories measured in decimals. But to the world outside, it was meaningless. A week later, another squadron vanished over France. He was in the command room when the reports came through. Static on the radio, silence. Then nothing. The tension in the room was unbearable, officers pacing, operators tapping at dead channels. The engineer stood in the corner, powerless to change any of it. Afterward, he walked alone down the corridor, past walls lined with framed photographs of smiling crews, all marked, missing in action. His own reflection stared back at him in the glass. He hardly recognized the man looking back, the hollow eyes, the unshaven face, the weight of failure in every movement. But inside that silence, a thought hardened. He wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when the answer felt so close. He knew he couldn't win command's support with words anymore. He needed proof, something undeniable. Something that would speak for itself. He turned off the corridor light and stepped into the cold night. The wind howled across the empty runway. He looked up at the sky, a vast, starless void, and whispered to no one, "If they won't see it, I'll make them." Days blurred into weeks. The weather turned harsher, the sky perpetually overcast, as if even the sun had grown tired of watching. The engineer's small workshop had become both a refuge and a prison. He no longer kept track of time, only measurements, failures, and faint flashes of possibility. Every experiment ended the same way, a flicker of distortion on the radar screen. Then a clear, merciless echo. The signal always found its way back, always betrayed the plane. He began to wonder if invisibility itself was a kind of madness, something men weren't meant to achieve. He ate when he remembered, slept when his body forced him to. The walls were lined with crumpled papers and sketches of wave patterns, as if he were mapping thoughts instead of equations. The others had stopped visiting. The laughter that once drifted from the mess hall no longer reached his corner of the base. But silence had become his companion silence and the ticking of the clock. One afternoon, his door opened unexpectedly. The squadron leader stepped in, a man whose face carried both authority and fatigue. He didn't waste words. "Command's reviewing projects next week. If this doesn't produce results, it's over." The engineer nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He just said, "Give me one more test." The officer hesitated, then sighed. "You'll have it. But that's all." When the door closed, the engineer stood alone again, listening to the faint echo of the officer's boots down the corridor. He turned back to his bench and whispered, "One more test." That night, the rain came hard, hammering the tin roof, pooling at the door. He worked by lamplight, every tool glinting like a shard of determination. His hands were cut and stained with oil, but he didn't care. He layered foil wax and fabric again, this time thinner, more carefully arranged. Each layer altered the signal slightly. He adjusted angles, measured distances, recorded pulse strengths. For hours, the air was filled with the hum of low-frequency waves and the scratch of pencil on paper. Near midnight, something changed. The reflection didn't vanish, but it stuttered, dipped, almost blinked out for a moment. His pulse quickened. He tried it again. Same result. The signal didn't behave normally. It bent around the target, scattering unevenly. He leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. It was hope. He stayed up until dawn refining the sample, marking every change. When he finally stepped outside, the sky was pale and empty, the world washed clean by rain. For the first time in months, he felt something close to belief. But belief didn't stop the losses. Later that day, another report came in, 3 bombers gone missing, radar confirming interception within minutes of crossing the coast. He watched as officers stood in grim silence, the weight of it pressing into every corner of the room. "Enemy radars getting sharper," someone muttered. "They're reading us like a map." The engineer turned away. He couldn't bear it. Every disappearance was another reason to keep going, another life the system had failed to protect. He clutched his notes tighter, the paper damp with sweat. When night fell again, he sat at his desk with a single thought burning in his mind. The test had worked, if only for a second. That second could mean survival. It could mean everything. He tore a clean sheet of paper from his notebook and began drafting a new proposal. This time, he would skip the formalities, the slow chain of command. He'd go directly to the squadron leader, to the men who flew. If anyone would understand what a single second could mean, it was them. By the time the clock struck 2, the report was finished, simple, direct, urgent. At the bottom, he signed his name and one line beneath it, recommend field test, volunteer crew required. He placed it on the officer's desk before dawn, his fingers trembling. Outside, the hangars were silent, the fog thick enough to hide the world. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. It was a gamble, one that could end his career or save countless lives. But deep down, he already knew the choice was made. There was no turning back now. He walked back to his workshop, the wind sharp against his face, and whispered to himself, one chance. That's all it takes. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the airfield, the faint hum of enemy radar pulsed through the sky. Steady, searching, unaware that its dominion was about to be challenged. It was past midnight again. The air inside the hangar was still and cold, heavy with the smell of fuel and damp steel. A single lamp burned on the corner of the table, its light pooling over stacks of drawings and test sheets. The engineer sat motionless, staring at the radar trace flickering weakly before him. He had run the experiment 20 times. 20 failures. The echo always came back, stubborn, sharp, mocking him. But something in his mind refused to break. He could feel it. The answer wasn't far. It hovered there invisible, waiting for him to see it. He rubbed his eyes and reached for his mug. Empty. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, leaving only a bitter stain at the bottom. He set it down, distracted, and turned to adjust the angle of the lamp. The light shifted, catching the surface of one of the old test sheets, and then he saw it again. The reflection shimmered, faint, delicate, but undeniable. The light bent slightly over the warped patch of wax and foil, creating a ripple of distortion. It was almost identical to what he'd seen weeks ago with the coffee stain. He froze, breath held. Slowly he tilted the paper again. The shimmer moved. The pattern beneath seemed to vanish for a heartbeat, then return. His pulse quickened. He grabbed his pencil, sketching quickly, muttering under his breath. It's not the metal. It's the surface. The signal bends. He spread out more samples, thin films, foil strips, scraps of treated canvas. He angled the lamp lower, imitating the sweep of a radar pulse. The reflections changed, some bright, some dull. One of them almost invisible. He leaned closer, studying it like a man reading a secret. The waxed surface scattered the light unevenly, breaking it into tiny fragments. If radar worked the same way, this might confuse it, misdirect it. He turned toward his transmitter. The low hum filled the room as he powered it on. The monitor flickered to life, tracing the pulse. He aimed it at the sample. The echo returned, faint and fragmented. He made a quick adjustment. A second layer of foil under the wax. The pulse blinked again, weaker this time. He stared at the screen, barely daring to breathe. The echo wasn't clean anymore. It jumped. Split, blurred into fragments. For a brief moment it almost vanished. His hand trembled on the control dial. That's it, he whispered. That's it. He tried it again. From another angle. The same result, the signal scattering, bending away, refusing to return in a straight line. His exhaustion melted into a rush of adrenaline. The pattern was clear now. The waves weren't bouncing back. They were being misdirected. He scribbled furiously into his notebook, words blending with half-drawn equations. Diffuse scatter, composite layering, field interference. He didn't need full understanding. He could see it, not in theory, but in light. A plane could be dressed in this material, layered just so, and it might vanish from radar for a heartbeat, maybe longer. He stepped back from the table and stared at the chaos of it all: coffee, stained sheets, improvised circuits, scraps of foil and paper. It looked nothing like a discovery. But somewhere in that chaos, he had found a path forward. He pressed his palms against the table, closing his eyes. Behind them, he could still see the shimmer of light, the way it curved, the way it refused to be caught. It wasn't invisibility, it was misdirection. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, not gone, just hidden. Outside, the wind howled against the hangar doors. The clock struck 3. He didn't move. The hum of the transmitter filled the silence like a heartbeat, steady and alive. And in that fragile rhythm, he felt it, the spark. The idea that could change everything. He didn't yet know how to build it, how to prove it, or how to convince anyone to believe it. But for the first time, he wasn't chasing a dream. He had found a trace of truth. The kind of truth that begins quietly, in solitude. In exhaustion, in the faint glow of a lamp on a winter night. He turned off the transmitter and stood still, the faint smell of ozone lingering in the air. Somewhere beyond the walls, the war raged on. But here, in this small forgotten corner of the world, a new kind of weapon had just been born, one made not of fire or steel, but of silence. The following days passed in a blur of obsession. The engineer barely slept. His world had narrowed to a single idea, bending the unseen. Every waking moment became an experiment, every failure a step closer to understanding. He began scavenging materials from the airfield's repair bays. Strips of aluminum. Lengths of cloth, discarded paint. To anyone watching, it must have looked like madness, an engineer patching together scraps while the rest of the world burned. But in his mind, the pattern was clear. He wasn't just building a surface, he was building an illusion. He coated one side of the metal with a thin layer of wax. Then he added microscopic threads of foil, irregular, uneven, designed to scatter light and waves in every direction. When he placed the sample before his transmitter again, the echo faltered. Not vanished, but confused, fractured into meaningless noise. He leaned closer, eyes wide. It was working. Each hour brought small refinements. A thinner layer here, a sharper edge there. The radar pulse grew fainter each time. He was teaching the metal to lie, to tell the radar it wasn't there. Outside, the airfield continued its rhythm of departure and loss. Engines thundered into the night, and every dawn returned fewer. The engineer kept working through it all. He heard the names of the missing whispered in corridors, but said nothing. His answer was taking shape, and it had to come before the next wave of funerals. On the fourth night, Lewis returned. The young technician stood in the doorway, watching him work under the flickering light. "You're still at it," he said softly. The engineer didn't look up. Almost there. Lewis stepped closer, glancing at the cluttered bench. "Command says your project's being reviewed again. They might shut it down." "I know. Then maybe rest before they do." The engineer smiled faintly. "If I stop now, they win. The radar wins." Lewis hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You really believe you can hide a plane?" The engineer looked up for the first time. His eyes were red, but steady. "Not hide," he said quietly. "Confuse. Make the enemy see ghosts." Lewis said nothing more. He left the room with that thought lingering in the air, half madness, half genius. That night, the engineer prepared his first full-scale test. He coated a small section of an old bomber wing with his new layered material. Under the dull light, it looked ordinary. Just another piece of worn metal. But under radar, it told a different story. He powered the transmitter. The familiar hum filled the hangar. On the screen, the echo appeared, sharp, steady. Then he angled the wing toward the receiver. The echo weakened, flickered, and vanished into background static. He froze. The hum continued, the pulse still beating, but the signal was gone. For a heartbeat, the wing didn't exist. He leaned closer, hands trembling. Then the echo reappeared, faint, distorted, uncertain. He repeated the test, changing angles, adjusting layers. Each time, the signal stumbled. He laughed under his breath, a quiet, almost disbelieving sound. "You can't see what you can't understand," he murmured. By dawn, he had run dozens of tests. The pattern was undeniable. When the coating was right, the radar couldn't find the object. It wasn't invisibility, not truly, it was confusion, interference. But in war, confusion could save lives. As the first light crept through the hangar windows, he slumped against the wall, staring at the flickering monitor. The coffee mug from weeks ago still sat nearby, ringed with dried stains, a small reminder of where it all began. He thought of the pilots who had vanished in the dark, the faces that haunted him, and for the first time, he allowed himself a thought he'd never dared before: maybe this could change their fate. When Lewis returned that morning, he found the engineer asleep at his bench, surrounded by half-burned notes and twisted scraps of foil. The monitor still glowed faintly beside him, tracing empty air. Lewis stepped closer, looked at the readings, and froze. The signal was gone. The radar saw nothing. He whispered, "Bloody hell, The engineer stirred, opening his eyes. His voice was hoarse. It worked, didn't it? Lewis nodded slowly. You made it disappear. The engineer smiled, barely awake. Not disappear, he murmured, just learned how to be unseen. He looked toward the open hangar door, where sunlight was just beginning to break through the fog. Next, he whispered, we'll see if the sky believes it too. The wind moved softly through the metal beams, carrying that line into the morning light, a promise made in exhaustion and brilliance. And as the day began, so did a quiet revolution, one born from a stain, a shimmer, and a man who refused to stop seeing what others couldn't. By early summer of 1942, the airfields of southern England had become factories of sacrifice. Every dawn, the same ritual unfolded, bombers lined like shadows across the runway, crews checking instruments with quiet precision, faces pale under the weak morning sun. Each man knew his odds. Each took off anyway, inside one of those hangars, far from the bustle of flight crews and the bark of officers. The engineer stood over his table with a single sheet of approval stamped in red E. Provisional field test authorized. He had done the impossible, convinced command to grant one trial. Just one. A single aircraft, modified with his material, would attempt to cross the channel that week. The test would decide everything, his work, his reputation, and perhaps the lives of countless others. But the approval came with conditions. No full support, no extra funding, no guarantee. If it failed, the project would be terminated, permanently. He ran his hand over the bomber's surface, the same cold metal that had betrayed so many on radar screens. Together with Lewis and a few trusted mechanics, he began applying the strange new coating. It was crude, uneven, and ugly, a patchwork of wax, foil, and treated canvas that shimmered faintly under the hangar lights. One mechanic frowned. You sure this'll fly, sir? Looks like we've dressed her for a funeral. The engineer didn't smile. Maybe we have, he said softly, but if it works, she'll live. Outside, the rain came and went in bursts, tapping against the hangar roof like the ticking of a clock counting down to judgment. Every sound seemed sharper, every movement slower. The squadron leader arrived that afternoon, his boots echoing on the concrete. He studied the coated aircraft with a skeptical eye. So this is your miracle? The engineer nodded once. She won't vanish, but she might just slip through unseen. Might doesn't win wars, the leader replied coldly. If this fails, you're done here. You understand, I do. For a long moment, they said nothing. The officer finally sighed, glancing at the men preparing the plane. We'll assign one pilot. He'll make the run tomorrow night, reconnaissance over the French coast. If he returns, we'll talk. If not, the sentence never finished. It didn't need to. That night, the engineer stayed behind after everyone left. The hangar was silent except for the distant hum of generators and the soft creak of metal cooling in the dark. He moved around the plane, checking every panel, every rivet, running his hand over the patchwork coating. It felt wrong, rough, uneven, but he knew it didn't matter how it looked. He paused beneath the wing, staring at the dull reflection of the lamp on the waxed surface. It caught the light strangely, bending it, scattering it, refusing to shine cleanly. He smiled faintly. It was imperfect, but it carried his hope. Lewis returned quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. You're still here, he said. I need to be sure. The engineer replied. Lewis handed him a mug, then hesitated. Do you think it'll work? The engineer looked at the plane, its patched skin glimmering in the low light. I don't know, he admitted. But I know we've given them a chance. Maybe that's enough. They drank in silence. The smell of fuel mixed with coffee and damp air. It was the scent of war, and of wary men daring to hope. When dawn came, the base stirred to life. The modified bomber rolled out onto the runway, its new skin dull against the pale sky. The crew assigned to the mission gathered nearby, a pilot named Matthews, his co-pilot, and 2 gunners.